Hi, Brendan.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Brendan Nyhan, noted political scientist, also something of a, I guess, public intellectual. You write you contribute to the Upshot series in the New York Times, and you've done a number of other things. You were a media critic for Columbia Journalism Review, and you used to have a feature a while ago now in Salon called, what was it, Spinsanity?
Spinsanity, yeah.
And I guess that led to a book that you co-authored called All the President's Spin, George W. Bush, the Media and the Truth.
That's right.
And so you're at Dartmouth, where you are a political scientist, and one of the main things you've been studying is how, I guess you could say, cognitive distortions influence our political process. So why people believe things are true when they're not, or believe things aren't true when they are. So to pick some examples out of the air, maybe why Bush supporters would believe things he says that aren't true, and why Bush critics might be reluctant to believe things he says that are true. In addition to that, you started an interesting thing, what's it called, Bright Line Watch, which is also relevant to the current moment because it's, amid all this concern about creeping authoritarianism, it's a way of monitoring in a somewhat rigorous or objective fashion, I guess, the actual health of our democracy on an ongoing basis. So I want to get around to talking about that too. But why don't we start off with this cognitive distortion issue? I'm just wondering, like, when you look at a recent event, for example, Donald Trump alleging that Barack Obama tapped his phone. Do you think you're just like processing that whole thing in a different way from the rest of us by virtue of what your area of focus has been?
In what sense? How am I processing?
Well, I mean, it's like, I'm sitting here wondering, like, how are Trump supporters processing this? And for that matter, Trump opponents, because in this particular case, I don't want to get down into the weeds, but I think the tendency of Trump opponents is to say, like, wow, this was just an out-and-out hallucination. This guy's crazy. And he may be, but actually I think when you look at it, there's as is often the case with Trump, there's some kind of kernel of something or other at the bottom. There is something he's alluding to. There's a report that in turn has some kind of connection to something that's factual. So I've noticed, like, a lot of Trump opponents aren't all that interested in really looking into that question. And I have no idea, because I don't converse very regularly with Trump supporters, I guess. I have no idea how they're processing this. And I'm wondering if you have any, like, theoretical predisposition that leads you to suspect what's going on in the mind of Trump supporters and Trump, or what. Or you can say no, and we can move on to the next question.
No, sure. No, it's a great example of the kind of factual disputes that we so often see that I study, which are ones where people have really strong directional biases. They'd like to believe that one side or the other is correct, and that influences the kinds of judgments that they reach. That everyone has some level of an accuracy motivation. We'd like to believe things that are true about the world, but in politics, that motivation is pretty weak. And these questions are often pretty murky, right? It's hard to arbitrate that question. And so it's easy for that directional motivation to kick in. And so Trump says this, makes this allegation, which he's never made before. And it hasn't been part of the kind of set of talking points that his allies have pushed. And you see people locking in on that and starting to repeat it and dig in as if they believe it to be true, right? And then likewise, other folks who view Trump negatively are, framing it as part of this narrative of his erratic behavior and his pattern of falsehoods, which is true, but maybe not acknowledging the extent to which there may have been, for instance, a wiretap, approved by the FISA court that targeted one of his associates, right? He said Trump Tower, right? So if, a Trump associate is in Trump Tower, then he's the subject of a wiretap, right, and so on and so forth. We can't arbitrate that with what we know right now, but you can certainly see how people's priors would drive the way they evaluate that dispute.
Right. And what? I mean, I remember. Let me ask you this: kind of, how depressed are you? How? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of the polarization of American politics, and I know that in past contact with you, you and I were part of a phone call a couple of years ago that we don't need to go into, but there was a conference call, and we were discussing some of your findings and some other findings in political science, and I remember getting a little discouraged about the prospects for for the polarization problem, which was a point of discussion even then, to get better. I mean, it has to do with the findings about how people process information that they see as in opposition to their view, contrary to their existing views, or coming from the other side, or whatever. And you can imagine, I guess, just getting into a downward spiral in terms of polarization. Some kind of, and I'm hoping you can cheer me up.
All right, well, I'll do my best. I mean, how depressed am I? I'm pretty depressed. We had an unprecedented amount of false information coming from a major party presidential candidate in this campaign. That is damaging, not just to how that campaign played out, but to the norms of our democracy going forward. So I think real damage has been done. And part of the reason that Trump was able to get away with that is that Republicans were locked in place, and they were locked in place by partisanship. Right? They have, one of the things we've found in political science is it's not just that we're more polarized; it's that our negative feelings about the other side have become especially polarized. Right? So it's not that we feel more warmly about our own party as much as it is we feel more negatively towards the other party.
Right?
Right? And you can think of that as helping to hold Trump's coalition in place. Right? He trades off some non-college educated whites and college educated whites relative to Mitt Romney, but for the most part, Republicans just vote for him, right? And that's the key to him winning despite what he does. So he doesn't pay a significant political price for this record of falsehoods, and that's really trouble. Does that mean every Trump voter believed everything he said? No, and that's why we saw all these rationalizations about he's like a guy at a bar, he's like your crazy uncle, he's speaking some larger truth even if he's not technically accurate. So it's not as if people couldn't recognize that specific statements he was making weren't accurate. And I've done research that finds this. When you actually give Trump supporters corrective information, in some cases we actually, especially in the form of fact checks, we actually found them updating their views to some extent. What they didn't do is change their mind about Trump, right? So the idea was, in other words, that people were willing to give some ground on the factual matter at hand, but they didn't punish Trump for making a false claim.
Was there anything particular about the kinds of input that change their mind? Or, I mean, if you're trying to change somebody's mind, is there something we can learn from this in terms of how you do it? Or maybe which issues they were most amenable to mind changing on?
We didn't test enough to really answer that systematically. And I mean, the problem with Trump, of course, is he flooded the zone, right? There were so many falsehoods that, now I'm mixing metaphors, but the fact checkers were kind of playing whack-a-mole across this huge volume of falsehoods. And so it was hard to address all of them. But again, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that we have to deal with, which is the idea that people are choosing who they vote for based on facts. That's not how human beings work. It's not how I work. It's not how you work. It's not how anyone watching makes up their mind about politics. We'd all like to think our politics are based on facts and the other sides are based on emotion and falsehoods, but that's the kind of pleasing falsehood that human beings tell to themselves, right? So, I don't think it's I think the idea that just giving Trump voters factual information, they're going to change their mind about him is misguided. But that doesn't mean they won't respond to factual information. So let me give you an example, Bob, and see what you think about it. Right. So the question people have had is Trump, are his voters kind of immune to the facts? Right. That's a kind of simplified view that people put out there. But take George W. Bush. Right. There were lots of people who thought he was politically impregnable after the 2001-2004 period. By 2008, the wheels were off. Right. He was setting new record lows for approval, and the reason was the country wasn't doing so well. Right. The economy wasn't that good. The Iraq War hadn't gone that well, and that reality could not be denied, despite people's wish to deny it, right? So that at some level, reality kicks in, right? At some level, people can't deny these things that are in front of their face. Not on every issue, but especially on these highly salient ones like war and the state of the country. I think information does get through. So the question is, to what extent and does that start to happen with Trump? Is that already happening?
Yeah. There is one, I think, new variable here, which is that, there's a whole area of study, which isn't yours in particular, but the way elites influence opinion more broadly. Elites, media elites, academics, particularly influential people. And part of Trump's ideology is to mistrust at least what used to be considered mainstream elites. That's actually part of the ideology, and he is reinforcing it by saying the media are enemies of the people, and so on. And I was just thinking about the George Bush example, and I remember thinking, well, how did a consensus develop that the war had been a disaster? I think it was to some extent elite mediated. I think people took the word of a broad swath of experts and commentators and so on. So I'm wondering if maybe one very significant thing has changed here.
No, that's right. We didn't see, certainly the Bush people objected to the way the media had covered the war, and they tried to counter that narrative. But they didn't try to fundamentally delegitimize the media to the same extent or other elite sources of information. And that's what's so dangerous about what Trump's doing now. You're absolutely right. The countervailing sources of information are an important check on the power of a small d democratic government, right? And so when Trump is trying to delegitimize all these other sources of information to tell people in a kind of tribal way, you cannot trust them, right? They are fake news. That's very dangerous, right? And it does potentially weaken people's willingness to listen to these other sources of information. I think he's probably speaking to a smaller hardcore group than the kind of, even the broad swath of his coalition there. Mm-hmm. I don't think, I bet there are a lot of Trump supporters who are not taking him literally or even seriously on that notion at this point. But it is dangerous, right? And those are the kinds of norm violations that have, political scientists and other experts like me worried about what we're seeing and what could make it, the kind of factual accountability process different under Trump than it was under Bush.
Yeah. Now, before we proceed, I want to say something about your bona fides, because I can imagine already commenters on our site writing, "Oh well, like two liberals lamenting Trump," and so and like many academics, I think you would be considered, roughly speaking, liberal, and as I've already mentioned, you used to do something for Salon, which kind of further makes the case. But you had you did this thing with American Prospect for a while, which is a liberal periodical, but you ultimately had kind of an unpleasant parting with them, I gather, precisely because you insisted on picking on liberal targets as well as conservative targets, right? Is that true?
That's right. And Spinstanity was nonpartisan too, and Michael Moore and Ted Rall and a bunch of liberals did not like the way we wrote about them there too. So I take nonpartisanship seriously. And actually, let me give your readers a more relevant example, because half of them will have no idea what we're talking about. No, 99% of them will have no idea what we're talking about. I just wrote something for the Upshot about the increase in conspiracy theory belief among Democrats since the election. And I think it's really important when you have these kinds of conversations to not let anyone off the hook, right? Trump is the most important source of misinformation in our country because he's the president of the United States. But it doesn't mean that Democrats or liberals are immune to these kinds of tendencies. They're absolutely not. And I've seen all sorts of sketchy information that people seem to want to believe about Trump circulating, right? Various wild claims about coup plots, and now various Homeland-style conspiracies people imagine between Trump and the Russians. There are lots of serious questions you can ask about what we've seen, but people are taking it much further, and I think it's very much driven by their politics in just the way we're describing with Trump supporters.
And one of the points of your Upshot piece about this was that there is a finding, I gather, that people are more prone to conspiracy theories when they perceive themselves as having lost power. So the fact that Democrats lost the election made them apparently more prone to conspiracy theories than they had been, and the reverse effect was seen to some extent with Trump supporters or Republicans, right?
That's right. They were less vulnerable now that they had power.
And, the Russian thing you mentioned, strictly speaking, that is in fact, it's a very classic conspiracy theory. That doesn't mean it's false. I mean, we don't know, but we don't know, but it's definitely a full-fledged conspiracy theory. Have you, from your vantage point, does it seem that people on Twitter and so on are, the liberals, that the Trump opponents are a little too quick to jump on evidence that may seem to support their suspicions about Russia, or have been insufficiently cognizant of reasons to be wary of the conspiracy theories?
Yes, no, absolutely, and I've been trying to warn people about this. I mean, at the same time, I've tried to sound the alarm because of the pattern of I see some of these what's on the record as consistent with the pattern of norm violations I've described, and so I've tried to help sound the alarm as a political scientist that there's some worrisome signs here of what's known on the record. But I do see people doing this kind of dot connecting that is consistent with a pattern of conspiracy theory belief, where everything is connected and part of a master plan, right? And if someone seems to cover up some particular meeting or phone call, it must mean they're elaborately scheming to protect some nefarious plan.
Right.
And the history of conspiracy theories teaches us that conspiracy theories can be real, right? You can certainly say Watergate was a conspiracy theory that was true, but they're often much more messy, and the reality is often much more messy and mundane than people imagine. And there are a lot of people leaping to conclusions in the Trump case when there may be not much there, right? Yeah. Clapper said on Sunday, there's no evidence of the Trump campaign colluding. People who presume, Flynn's guilt, having neglected or ignored the reporting that says, on those phone calls, there's nothing damning, right? Having the phone calls raises lots of questions, but the leaks that have been made so far suggest that nobody in the intelligence community has the goods, and they have the recordings of the phone calls, right? So again, if there were some grand conspiracy, you'd start to see more signs, probably, right? So all we have are these kind of whiffs of smoke, and we're seeing people extrapolate them into elaborate conspiracies.
Right. I remember before the election, you may remember this, there was a piece in Slate by Franklin Foer about this computer connected to the Trump organization, and all this communication it was doing with Russian computers. You remember this? They made a big deal of it. And I thought it seemed like pretty persuasive to me. But then I see this piece in The Intercept that seemed equally persuasive, concluding that actually this was just like spam going on between these two computers.
All the technical people that I saw said, "Ha ha ha, no," when that came out, right? And again,
they dismissed
it as a misunderstanding of the way a server was configured as some sort of elaborate conspiracy.
Well, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, so again, this is a classic example, though. It kind of functions as kind of Rorschach blot, right, onto which we all project our predispositions, right? Mm-hmm. Now, again, you can say in the context of all the concerns about Trump and Russia, therefore we have to be really risk averse and investigate all of these things. Again, it's certainly an example where people's willingness to believe ran out ahead of the evidence of something nefarious actually going on.
And to complete the circle, as we tape this, more will be known by the time this runs probably, but it seems like one very plausible speculation that I think is circulating is that computer that was actually not technically part of the Trump organization, but was part of a marketing firm hired by the Trump organization or something, maybe what is at the bottom of Trump's allegation of wiretapping. There are some people who think that there was a FISA request to look at that computer, and that got blown out by Breitbart, and Trump wakes up, and so it's like a tangled web. Now, one thing I was saying, I got a little depressed when I heard some of the work that you referred to in an earlier conversation of ours. As I recall, one of the findings was that when you present people with information that's contrary to their views, it's, at least under some circumstances, it's not just that it doesn't make a dent, it actually reinforces their conviction that their views are right, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. We've called this the backfire effect. And it is a finding that we found in some early research we did, giving people factual information, and the group that was most vulnerable to the myth we were trying to correct, in the context of a he said, she said style news report, when they got that corrective information, they were actually, in some cases, not every case, more likely to believe in the myth when they were presented with the corrective information rather than less. And I don't want to suggest that it happens all the time. There are lots of other studies that don't find that effect, some by myself, some by other researchers. But it highlights the idea that we shouldn't just assume that giving people facts is persuasive, right? We have now, I mean, just to take an example a lot of viewers will be familiar with, right? The climate debate is 30 years of people throwing facts and science at people, thinking it will change their minds about the facts at issue, and it hasn't. And I think while we can't say there'll be a backfire in every case, we should at least question the assumption that facts will change people's beliefs when they run contrary to what we'd like to believe to be true.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything you would suggest to people who are trying to present facts to people who disagree with them in a way that will be as persuasive as possible?
Yeah, so I've written a lot about this, and there's definitely lots more information on my website if people want to check it out. There's a bunch of ideas we've proposed, and with varying levels of evidentiary support or theories that these kinds of strategies are consistent with in the literature. So, for instance, making it less threatening to people's identity to admit that they're wrong, right? So, Bob Inglis is a former Republican member of Congress who's promoting conservative approaches to climate change. He was primaried, and he's trying to essentially provide a way to be a Republican, to be a conservative, and to acknowledge the existence of climate change. And so he may be a source of information who's more persuasive, and he may be able to speak about it in a way that's less threatening to people's worldviews than a liberal scientist, shoving studies in people's face. Right, so that's one kind of strategy. There may be more effective ways to produce data. And in some cases, there may be evidence from the real world, like we spoke about before, that breaks through more effectively than any particular, kind of harangue from an advocate. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you're in Florida and there's an octopus in your parking garage, if you saw that on the internet, right, that is a very visceral reminder of climate change. Right? The sea is literally rising into your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So people in those kinds of situations may be more willing to revise their views because they're confronted with this reality mm-hmm. that's harder and harder to deny. None of that is a silver bullet by any stretch. That's why these myths last so long, right? People still believe President Obama wasn't born in this country. We have the birth certificate. We've had it for years, right? In a lot of cases, it's also about the elite cues that are out there. And so that's the last thing I would say in terms of your question. It matters a lot what people say. If conservative and Republican elites stop denying the existence of climate change, we'll see a big shift on that issue. But for now, people are getting signals that that is what your tribe believes, mm-hmm. right? And that's the way you should. If you trust me, this is the factual belief that is best aligned with your worldview and which you should listen to, right? And so it really matters a lot what kinds of cues people get from elites, because of course, normal people don't think a lot about climate before this became a politicized issue. They don't read climate studies, right? We all take cues, and those polarized cues about facts can matter a lot.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one thing that's emerging is it helps to have validators. I mean, people who are considered elites who are trusted by the people that you would like to persuade, mm-hmm. which is not always easy to arrange. I'd say, I was talking earlier about how, Trump may have moved us into a place where elites aren't trusted. Strictly speaking, that's almost never true. I mean, any ideological group has their elites. Right. It's just that there seems to be a sharp line. They seem to be relatively few in number here, and there was a pretty sharp line. The ones I'm thinking of, the elites I'm thinking of, are so ideologically committed to Trump that you're probably not going to see a lot of information moving back and forth in a constructive way.
Right. Now, there may be people who straddle there, so that the never Trump Republicans are likely to be more credible at communicating information than people who would oppose any Republican president, right? So that David, with the fact that all these former Bush administration officials like David Frum and Elliot Cohen and Peter Wehner and Michael Gerson are all speaking out against Trump, they may be much more effective at communicating information credibly than the Center for American Progress.
Although some of them are as vehement as the most ardent liberal, and I wonder.
They are. No, they are. But they speak from a position where at least you can't say it's some sort of a liberal elite who's out to get Republicans.
Right, but I just wonder if they aren't slowly blowing their credibility in the eyes of Trump supporters.
Well, and so that's also a question of when people will start to, if we see internal dissidents emerge, right? So, people asked a question after the way the ban was rolled out, would Kelly resign and denounce the ban, right? So if there are people who are especially credible from within the administration, right, again, that's a kind of surprising signal, right? So Frum's opposition is no longer surprising.
Right.
The existence of never Trump Republicans is no longer surprising, right? So what's the new information that's going to cause people to update their beliefs, right? It would have to be something new. I mean, maybe, Paul Ryan, right? Or, some of these folks in the Republican Party who have not flipped on Trump since he reconsolidated the party after the Access Hollywood tape. Mm-hmm. That could be the kind of next shoe to drop. And it may never drop, but those are the kinds of people who might move the needle.
Right. And you do have these people who have been measured in their criticism, like McCain and Lindsey Graham, who I would assume still have pretty considerable credibility by virtue of their histories, and they have not become they're not known as never Trumpers, and although at one point I think Graham qualified as that, they've
straddled the line. In fact, McCain talks about this issue in the New York Magazine profile of he has to maintain his, there's some kind of a discussion of his need to maintain his credibility and not always be crying wolf. Mm-hmm. Those folks who aren't always speaking out against Trump, when they do, they may have more of an impact.
Okay. So, there are independent of political science, there is the study of so-called cognitive biases in psychology and various other kinds of study in psychology that are relevant. Do you think there are particular known biases that are the most significant in this context?
Well, I mean, the one that's driving the response that we're talking about is often called disconfirmation bias, right? When you're told that you're wrong, we as human beings tend to be unduly skeptical of that information. So,
maybe we should remind people what confirmation bias is to begin with, right? That
sure.
is a classic and is also at play here to some extent, I'm sure. But
right. So the flip side of disconfirmation bias, confirmation bias, right? I tell you something that's pleasing to you, that's consistent with what you like to believe about the world, and you're too accepting of it. You're too willing to believe it, right? And so, when you think about people's worries about people watching Fox News or MSNBC and getting fed a kind of diet of information that reaffirms their worldview, right? That's confirmation bias. But the flip side is we get that information that's unwelcome and we reject it. We counter-argue. We think of reasons we can't trust the source, and that closes our minds to information we might otherwise have accepted.
Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about this authoritarianism issue. Talk about this how this Bright Line project you're involved in works.
Sure. So first, I should make clear that I'm only speaking for myself and not for the group.
There's a group of academics who have launched this Bright Line Watch thing. Right?
That's right. It's myself, my colleague John Kerry here at Dartmouth, Gretchen Helmke at the University of Rochester, and Susan Stokes at Yale. And the four of us have gotten together to try to draw attention to the state of American democracy and bring to bear expert judgments on where we are as a country, and to update those regularly. So to draw people's attention to this question of what is the state of American democracy right now, and then to continue to monitor that state going forward. It's very much a nonpartisan effort. We just released our first expert survey of more than 1,500 political scientists, and I think the evidence in the survey indicates quite clearly that people aren't just using this as a kind of animus for anti-Trump views. They have quite measured and professional assessments of the state of American democracy, and I think those are meaningful because there's no single indicator that you can point to say this is how well democracy is doing. And so what we asked about instead was a bunch of characteristics that are among those that political scientists have identified as most important. And we said, how well is the U.S. doing in this particular area?
So what are some of those dimensions?
So those would, so the most fundamental respondents told us was fraud-free elections, right? That votes are counted and they're not manipulated, they're not fraudulent, and the allocation of power is determined on the basis of those elections, right? So that's the kind of so-called minimalist version of democracy. Mm-hmm. And then there's a group of kind of restrictions on power, like the freedom of the press, the ability of the courts to limit government's power and things like that. And then it moves on to some different areas of more of what you might think of as liberal democracy, and then finally to some kind of norms, like for instance, basing policy on scientific evidence and facts, or not, accusing the other side of being unpatriotic, for instance. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the things that respondents said were the least essential to democracy. Those are often a lot of the areas where Trump has violated norms have been in those lower priority categories. Mm-hmm. It's at least a way to say, this is where we are at the start of the Trump administration. And then again, speaking only for myself, what I've tried to suggest to people is that they should take seriously the idea that norms of democracy can erode slowly over time. People have expected this kind of dramatic Hollywood-style shift, and when it doesn't happen, they say, well, all those fears are unfounded. Mm-hmm. And the history of so-called democratic backsliding suggests that these processes are often much more gradual and long-term. And that's precisely why we have to be so attentive to the status of these democratic standards over time. Our norms have already shifted. We've already become accustomed to the idea of, it's fairly routine now for the President of the United States to accuse the former president of what would be one of the greatest political scandals in history. And it was barely even news. Trump tossed it off and went and played golf. We're already in quite a bizarre situation, and we become accustomed to that very quickly. And so, what we hope to do is to kind of remind people where we are and take stock of that in a systematic and nonpartisan.
So that is reflected in one of the dimensions of this kind of survey. So that which rubric would that come under again?
I'm not sure. I'd have to bore your listeners by looking up the list of there's 19 statements. So I'm not sure. And I guess that's precisely the point. It's quite murky right now. Uh-huh. A lot of the ways that Trump has violated norms are not in those most fundamental areas yet, right? So he has not transgressed those most fundamental democratic practices and norms. Thankfully, and he may never, right? And I would be like nothing.
You mean like defying a court order or what?
Right. So, he threatened during the campaign to imprison his political opponent. Right. That would be
that's a warning sign. Yes.
That was an unprecedented act. If he had followed through on that, we'd be having a much different conversation, or we might not be having this conversation for fear of our own legal status. Right. So. So a lot of his violations to this point have been rhetorical, right? He's violated norms on what is said by a major party presidential candidate, a president-elect, and now a president, right? Mm-hmm. Calling for his opponent to be imprisoned, attacking the ethnicity of a federal judge, suggesting that a judge would be blamed for a terrorist attack in the future. Go on down the list. Those are worrisome, but they aren't in those most fundamental areas of democracy. He hasn't used his institutional powers in a way that would be, truly worrisome to the status of American democracy, right? And so that set of standards is a kind of check on all of our, alarm, that some people feel about where we are, right? And so it's always important to kind of calibrate how worried we should really be. And again, we're trying to provide a kind of standard for that. I would just suggest to your readers, that they haven't seen it, the Upshot did a parallel piece with a kind of mini expert panel where they asked a pool of experts, including some of our respondents. We believe our survey was anonymous. For a series of events, how important they were and how normal or abnormal they were. And it was another way of trying to think about, how much of this is normal day-to-day politics and how much of this is something truly irregular. Right? And I think that's really a fundamental question we have to ask again and again in the time of Trump, because those things can bleed together very easily and people can mistake one for the other.
Do you remember what some of the things were that were judged most abnormal?
The attack on I believe the attack on the judge was one of them. Again, tedious person looking at the internet.
So we'll link to that.
Please link to it. But I think it's worth thinking about. Like, what you want to think about if you're worried are the important acts that are abnormal. Right? He does lots of unimportant things that are abnormal. Right? And he does lots of important things that are what presidents do. Right? And the things that are of concern for democracy are those ones that are both important and abnormal. And I think that upshot piece, helps people think about that.
So with the Bright Line you watch, you're going to check in with the same kind of panel of experts, and they're going to periodically, and they're going to judge each dimension. How are we doing along this particular dimension? And then you kind of, in the aggregate, it will say something about whether we are sliding toward authoritarianism.
That's right. And so we can distinguish these specific areas. So instead of just saying, well, democracy's getting worse, we can say in this area, experts view there to have been a significant deterioration, and in this other area, people were worried about. Actually, we haven't seen evidence that's been persuasive to our respondents. And we're also going to try to bring together experts who have studied these kinds of processes in other countries to catalyze the conversation about what we should worry about or expect here. Right, because this is not a kind of knowledge base that we have in American politics. This is something we've taken for granted in my field of American politics within political science. We've taken democratic stability for granted. I think that's an assumption that's no longer tenable. Even if we may be fine, and so we need that expertise that other folks have who've studied other parts of the world.
Now, no doubt, this group of experts, being academics, are on balance critics of Trump's, but I guess the hope is, first of all, the key is the relative measurement through time. They made their initial assessment of where we are, so that's not the issue. The issue is how the view changes over time. And I guess the hope is that they aren't overwhelmed by some kind of interest in showing that Trump is destroying America, right?
That's right. We think they're answering the survey, at least from our first wave, as scholars, and their incentives are different, right? In our professional community, understanding the world objectively matters, and events falsify our claims, right? In just the way we described. It doesn't mean that people don't have their own political views or there aren't areas of scholarship that where politics drive the conclusions. That can happen. But I think this is a case where there's a lot of real nonpartisan expertise, right? There's no particular American political view on how Venezuelan democracy deteriorated, or Turkish democracy, or Russian democracy. Those don't map into the American political divide. And those are the kinds of cases that people are talking about when they're thinking of these processes, where you see democratic backsliding. What are the most worrisome signs? Where was there deterioration first? What should we watch out for? How could it have been more effectively countered? There's no magic answer here either. Our knowledge base is limited. We can't experiment on countries, right? So the kind of scientific processes has inherent limitations when you're talking about, democratic, human systems of government. But there are things we can learn, and we do hope to bring those to bear. Okay.
Of course, one reason that there is this kind of challenge that almost any panel of experts is going to probably take a dim view of Trump. One reason for that is that it's not just that there's a liberal bias in academia. It's that, as we said, at the level of elites generally, just kind of academics, intellectuals, journalists, there's a particularly widespread rejection of this particular president. And I'm wondering, thinking historically, do you know of anyone who's come up with anything that's quite comparable? I remember Reagan was viewed dimly by a lot of people. Eisenhower in a different way, certainly by, academics maybe, I don't know, but do you think there's ever been such a wholesale rejection of a president by the establishment, so to speak?
I'm not enough of a political historian to give you the answer. I've heard people draw analogies to Jackson, who Trump has hung a portrait up of in terms of the way he campaigned against elites. Look, the kind of contemporary technocratic apparatus that is allied against Trump is like nothing we had in previous eras of American history, right? I mean, there's this vast kind of professional educated class that, you're right, is absolutely in the aggregate opposed to Trump. And that's why, we saw college educated whites moving against Trump in large numbers, right? It's just that non-college educated whites were moving for him, and there are more of them, so that offset his losses, right? So even among Republicans and independents who might otherwise have voted Republican, right, they were moving away from Trump. And, it just is what it is, right? I mean, people have to draw their own conclusions about whether the judgments of experts are being tainted by bias. And again, this is where I can only say it's very healthy to think about those many folks out there who have no liberal or democratic skin in the game and are raising the same kinds of alarms, right? Evan McMullen, right? We talked about Frum and Cohen and Wenner and Gerson. Like there's this, Tom Nichols is a political science professor at the Naval War College, who's a conservative who's been very outspoken about Trump. The National Review, right, ran a whole issue, right? You can go on and on down the list. So I think it's important to avoid creating those kinds of tribal boxes and just saying critics of Trump are liberal and that is why they are critics of Trump.
Yeah, I think that certainly is not the case. At the same time, I'm not sure I'd say none of these people have a vested interest of sorts. I mean, Evan McMullen would like to be president, actually.
right.
And, all of these people are, it's been interesting to watch, actually, the way, say, neoconservatives, I think, have expanded their own base by, I'm to some extent extrapolating, but, like Bill Kristol, you see some of his tweets retweeted just jillions of, just anti-Trump tweet after anti-Trump tweet, and he's picking up followers who don't remember that he helped bring us the Iraq War, right? I mean, who are liberals and are going, yeah, this guy's on my side, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but what I'm actually getting back around to is that any of us who have been on social media know that you get positive reinforcement. You get a lot of retweets. And so although I take your point that the initial rejection of Trump was unusually widespread, like Bill Kristol made the decision to not be on his team, at the same time, I guess I'm actually a little concerned in a way, the way positive reinforcement on social media deepens all of our tribalism in a certain sense, if that makes sense. And that makes us more inclined to do things and say things that reinforces the other side's tribal allegiance because we seem more and more like the enemy or more and more like we're scoffing at them or whatever. And I do it myself. I find myself doing it. I'm not immune.
Yeah, no, I mean, let me just say a couple things. I mean, in terms of the Bill Kristol of the world, I would actually interpret it differently. Their opposition to, the Weekly Standard and National Review, the folks they have who've opposed Trump, I think it's been very damaging to their careers, their standing in the movement, and likely the financial base of those magazines. You would know more than I about the business case or lack thereof for those kinds of publications, but it's tough to be opposing a president of your party as an ideological magazine. So I view that as a real act of courage, to be honest, of people acting against their interests. Like Bill Kristol is getting retweets by people the people who are paying his salary hate the people who are retweeting him. It does not help. I'm not sure it's helping him in any way. Maybe he gets more establishment legitimacy and credibility, but let's not divert on Bill Kristol.
Yeah.
The social media point, though, I think is important. I just want to say a couple things. One is normal people don't use Twitter, and Facebook is what you have to think about when you think about normal people, right? So I guess I would make the distinction between the kind of weirdly plugged in people like you and I and normal people. And very few people use Twitter as a proportion of the population. And so that's kind of a separate conversation. I do think it can promote that kind of echo chamber effect to some extent. Normal people on Facebook, there's some evidence, but it's weaker than people realize. Most people just don't follow politics very closely. So I guess I would actually say, in some ways, people worry too much about average people having echo chambers relative to how much they're actually in them, and don't worry enough about elites having echo chambers.
Yeah.
Right. And that may be where more of the problem is, with that. There's a set of elites who are living within, especially a Twitter, partial echo chamber, 16 hours a day, and that may kind of warp your view of what people think, and just even your incentives, right? Like, we're all getting those dopamine rushes when we get those retweets,
right?
And we're just the rat hitting the bar in the scientific study for more of whatever is being given out.
Now, and how would you compare Facebook in terms of the dynamic? I mean, first of all, Twitter is more of an elite medium, and Facebook more of a grassroots medium. Although there's a lot of overlap, but they also have slightly different dynamics. Have you paid much attention to how this all works in Facebook?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, is it tending to reinforce the tribal divide? I mean, I don't spend much time on Facebook, but I sense that there is much the same tribalizing effect, which is that people are mainly friends with people who share their values, and so they mainly hear from people who share their values, and then to the extent that there is engagement on Facebook with people who disagree with them, which I think happens, I'm not sure it's constructive. I think maybe there is the tendency, precisely because you feel surrounded by friends, you feel surrounded by allies, watching the encounter with the alien, and so you're likely to treat the alien with exactly the kind of contempt that only reinforces the alien's worldview and contempt of you. This is totally abstract, but... Right.
So some Facebook data scientists did a study of the extent to which people are seeing and, kind of attitude-consistent news items, right? Things that tend to be shared by people on their side. How much of that is driven by what our friends share versus the algorithm? How much are we differentially selecting those out of our news feed? And then there's further studies of how people interact in comment threads and so forth. I do think it's worrisome. I think in some cases people overstate the extent of it relative to the rest of our lives, right? There's this idea of treating the internet as this like separate sphere, right? Where, we all in real life also interact with people who tend to share our values, right? To some extent, right? Mm-hmm. And, sometimes we overstate the difference between those. In terms of the stuff I study, what I worry about with Facebook is the way they created this vast distribution platform for, so-called fake news, right? Because they're so big, right? Even if people don't actually read that much fake news, you could reach so many hundreds of millions of people that it was attracting people into this market to write bogus stories to get them shared on Facebook and to sell Google ads against them. And, they're starting to try to deal with that. But it's a real problem. It's one thing to have an echo chamber where people say, I agree with you. It's another thing to say, Hillary Clinton had this person murdered. Right. And we have those kinds of stories out there getting millions of shares.
Or the Pope endorsed Trump, which also had widespread distribution. I suspect that maybe the Facebook algorithm also contributes to the problem. I mean, remember, unlike Twitter, Facebook doesn't show you everything that your friends, the people you follow, are giving you, and it basically shows you, I think it shows you things from people you have tended to interact with before, which kind of reinforces the tribalism, because that probably means it's either your friends and allies or maybe some alien who would so arouse you that you fall back. But also, I think once something gets a little momentum on Facebook, leave aside your own clicking history, I think it's more likely to show it to you. And I mean, this all makes sense if your goal is, as Facebook's is, to maximize engagement. Right. But when you think about the way this is going to play out, and Zuckerberg hasn't talked about about this, but I would like somebody to look closely at just the fundamental algorithm of Facebook. Of course, it'd be easier to do if he'd tell us what it is, which, so far as I know, he hasn't, right? But,
no, it's a business secret.
That's right. And I think he's got, I think he owes us a little more transparency, because it could be that the algorithm itself is deepening political polarization.
Right. And the study I referenced does try to estimate the effect of the algorithm. But the thing that's tricky about that is the algorithm is always changing, right? They're always optimizing the algorithm in various ways. And so what was true in 2012 or 2013 or whatever year that study was conducted may not be true now. Mm-hmm. But this is also why it's so important. I think, something we haven't talked about is the kind of role of upholding public norms and shaming people who violate them, right? And that includes institutions, right? Facebook was shamed for what it enabled in this election.
Right.
And they've responded, right? So they've now partnered with the International Fact-Checking Network to set up this process where you will get a warning under identified bogus stories saying this has been disputed by third-party fact-checkers. And then again, if you try to share it, will again nudge you and say this has been disputed. Now, it remains to be seen how effective that is, if the fact-checkers can keep up with the flood of stuff that's being put out there.
Yeah.
But it's at least a signal that kind of reputational pressure, that social sanction, can matter. And I hope that we don't lose sight of that, because when we have the First Amendment, there's no regulatory solutions to these problems, right? And so it's up to all of us to kind of uphold the civil society norms that we'd like to see. And 2016 was a low point I hope we don't repeat, but we can't just assume that'll happen. We have to take steps to achieve it.
And I don't envy them. I mean, they've got it's easy to be critical, but they've got a tough job. They are suddenly an incredibly powerful thing. And, so I hope they do the right thing, whatever that is. So I kind of hinted at this earlier. I don't think I asked the question quite like this, but does this, does your consciousness of the way all of these things play out, your greater degree of expertise than most of us have, does that influence the way you conduct yourself on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you find yourself, in terms of retweeting things you're tempted to retweet, or the way the tone of voice in interacting with people or anything?
I mean, I'm human and I've made mistakes, absolutely. That's the first thing, is we also have to normalize the ability of people to be wrong. Right. And so that when we are wrong, we take responsibility for it and address it. Right. So I've retweeted things that were wrong, and I've unretweeted them and posted, I was wrong. This thing I retweeted was wrong. Don't listen. And that's not ideal. Right. I mean, this kind of medium lends itself to these viral misinformation blasting past our barriers. I try to model respectful engagement, and try to focus on what I can contribute in terms of my particular expertise. At this point, honestly, what I also am trying to do is just bring kind of performing my state of mind as a political scientist, right? Because there are so many forces in our society that will inherently normalize the kind of major party presidential candidate and then the president of the United States, right? That person kind of creates a political reality in what can be a very dangerous way. And so I'm trying to often communicate, this thing you're seeing, whatever you think about it, is really abnormal. Do not treat this as usual. Like, I've never seen anything like this in my career. This is not something we've seen in contemporary American democracy. So, that's become a kind of goal of mine in social media, because the world has gotten so weird. I mean, in the 2012, political scientist 2012 campaign, my role is to say, this thing you think about why Mitt Romney's losing isn't probably that based on very strong evidence, right? That's mostly what I contributed, right? Which is fine. And now here we are, and I'm contributing oh my God, the presidential candidate is starting to lock up his opponent, right? That's really bad. But I'm also trying to, I guess the last thing I would say is just try to calibrate myself, right? When normal things happen, right? We should also acknowledge those, right? It can't be all outrage all the time, right? People have to be calibrating, right? So Trump just appointed a respected Russia expert to his staff, right? Someone who's seen as being appropriately tough on Putin, not in any way consistent with the point of view that's been attributed to him about Russia, right? That's a notable event, right? It runs counter to the narrative. It's easy to let it go by, and a lot of people did, but that was something I tried to take care to retweet and say, hey, this is something you should acknowledge too. It looks more normal.
This is this woman from Brookings, right? Fiona something? Or?
Yeah, Fiona something. Hill, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what else. Well, one thing maybe we should underscore is that, we've talked a lot about the phenomenon of Trump and Trumpism and Trump supporters and how aberrant he is. At the same time, the premise of your work, broadly speaking, is that, although Trump critics look at Trump supporters and go and are inclined to say, what exact derangement do they suffer from? I think the premise of your work is that basic principles of human psychology that apply to all of us explain what's going on in their heads, right?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need anything. You don't need any elaborate explanation, right, for the kind of basic motivated reasoning and tribalism that we've seen, and that. But it is. I want to make sure listeners hear it's a really deep challenge. So my profession in the post World War II period said, you know what the problem with American politics is? The parties aren't polarized enough. Right? That was a time when the parties were seen as indistinct. It was hard for people to figure out where they stood. They didn't offer clearly delineated platforms. And the American Political Science Association issued a report that said we need more responsible parties. Now here we are, and the polarization we've seen has strained our institutions, but even more fundamentally, it's created a situation, right, where the negative partisanship people feel towards the other party is so strong, right, that it's very hard to get people to cross party lines under any circumstances, right, in terms of flipping who they vote for in the public or in members of Congress holding their own party accountable, right? And the belief polarization we see is so profound that people are quite vulnerable to myths and misconceptions that make the other side look bad or that are promoted by their side of the political aisle, right? And we just did not, as a profession, take those concerns seriously enough, right? Polarization in some ways is understandable and even laudable, but those are fundamental challenges, and we should very much see what's happened with Trump as unique as he is in that larger context.
And do you think, I mean, in terms of combating polarization, respectful engagement, which you alluded to, if done on a broad enough scale, could actually have an impact? Because some of the polarization is like, it just seems to me the two tribes reacting to the perceived hostility from the others, or the perceived contempt, which is a particularly important variable, I think, with the Trump supporters.
I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one is, there's polarization, there's polarization. Trump pivoted the Republican Party towards this specific kind of ethno-nationalism that lends itself to an especially ugly kind of tribalism, right? And, that if that continues, that's a different animal than just liberal versus conservative polarization. So, he's opening a lot of doors that we may not want to open as a society, right? Because of the way human beings react when identity is primed in that tribal manner. So I would just say we should be careful about just saying polarization, right? He did something different. And the particular kind of polarization he's unleashed may be more pernicious. And in terms of respectful engagement, right? I think it's important. I think we all have to show respect. I also think we have to be realistic that, if you're thinking about how to address the strain on our institution that Trump is creating, in some ways, given the way parties work in our country, that's something that the Republican Party has to deal with internally, right? The respectful engagement from outside of the Republican Party will only go so far when 80+% of Republicans approve of Trump and they're holding their members of Congress in place, and those members of Congress aren't conducting oversight, aren't speaking out against him when he violates norms, et cetera, right? So, we're in a two-party system, and like I love to see respectful engagement across those party lines, but the parties are absolutely essential institutions of democracy, and one of them is in a bad place right now, and that the folks within it who are fighting the good fight, I think, have an especially important role to play, because again, they can respectfully engage within the party in a way that's different than someone outside can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're about out of time, but I want to close with some good news, kind of, and this may be news to you, actually. Now, this gets back to the prior contact between you and me that I alluded to. It was a conference call with some people who research public opinion and changes on public opinion, do studies, and what it was about was that a funder, an NGO that was funding Bloggingheads, this website, several years ago, wanted to see a study of whether Bloggingheads ever had a constructive effect on the world. And I'm not actually, we were talking about how to set up the study. I'm not even sure if you saw the data that finally came out, but the finding was, okay, so this is news to you. The finding was this, and it was well controlled, it was a well controlled experiment. I mean, that said, I think you'd want to replicate it a bunch of times because this kind of experiment is inherently hard to do. But the finding was this: if you can do it either way, conservatives, liberals, but say conservatives are watching a conservative and a liberal debate a particular issue, and in one of the study groups, they see the liberal make a concession. So they see the person on the other side of the ideological divide make a concession. They say, yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, let's say it's minimum wage, and it's the liberal says, no, I agree with you that it should never go above this, or it's the conservative saying, oh, I agree with you, there should be some floor on the minimum wage. Even a concession like that, as opposed to the no concession condition, led people to be more inclined to rate the opponent elite favorably relative to the ally elite. So if you ask them to judge, well, which of these people, how credible are they, for example, then the credibility gap shrunk. You attributed more credibility to the person on the other side of the divide if they did say, yeah, you make a good point, I agree, or if they just volunteered that I concede this one point that the other side makes. So, it was only a preliminary study, but I do think, this just comports with long-standing conventional wisdom by people who make a living persuading people, is like, be gracious, say, yes, you make a good point, and sometimes, and I don't do that naturally, God knows, and I think sometimes it's discouraged in the social media context we find ourselves in. But
right. No, we need to carve out spaces where people can engage in that kind of conversation, right? Where the norms are different and the incentives are different, right? If you go on TV and you just have to shout your point,
right, there's
no incentive to concede the other side is wrong. You're just opening yourself up,
right?
And we need these alternative spaces and norms. So I think that kind of discourse is really valuable. And I've seen thoughtful conversations on Bloggingheads of precisely that nature, where there's a real give and take. Yeah, and we can and people can model that. I guess that's the point to make, right? And people can acknowledge the legitimacy of the other side's arguments, and even the legitimacy of the other side's role in that debate, right? I mean, one of the things that liberals are now acknowledging about George W. Bush is, for all of his opposition to them in various ways, he acknowledged the legitimacy of a free press, as he just reaffirmed publicly a few days ago. But implicitly, he granted their role, right? And he acknowledged their role, and he engaged in give and take with them, and sometimes he conceded they were right, and that kind of inherent respect and acknowledgement is an important part of how we signal we're all playing the same game as part of a democracy, right? And these civic norms and rituals are kind of invisible to us, right? And I think it's important to be a little more self-conscious about them and realize as we see more extreme versions of people moving away from them, be more explicit about the kinds of practices we want to promote and emulate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Brendan. So people can, as I said, they can find your work. Periodically you contribute to the Upshot. There is this Bright Line Watch that they can Google. It's gotten a certain amount of press coverage. And then you tweet. What is it? Is your handle Brendan Nyhan?
Yeah, that's right.
That one wasn't taken, huh? By all the other Brendan Nyhans in the world.
There's one other one out there. But
is there?
Yeah.
Have
he's
you
coming for me. Yeah. I'm gonna get him to change it.
Yeah, you really should. I can't imagine he had the nerve to have the same name as you. So, but thank you so much. And maybe down the road, I'll keep an eye on your Bright Line Watch. And if we do begin to slide perilously into authoritarianism, maybe I'll bring you back on to warn us.
Okay. Hopefully you'll never need to do that.
I hope so. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, Brent. Bye-bye.
Bye.